All right, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining our session today. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen in just a second. But before that, I wanted to give everybody just a little bit of an idea of what to expect. So there are a few different options for this, and we signed up for the TED Talk format. So the first 15 minutes will be us presenting a talk. We'll have slides. It will not be interactive. We won't be taking questions during that time. And then we have plenty of time for questions and discussion after that. So Mary and I are both happy to answer questions. Unfortunately, Mary's camera is not working, so I assure you that she is a real person, and I wish we could see her, but we'll hear her voice. Mary, I'm going to share my screen, and if there's anything that happens in the chat or you're not seeing the screen or something, can you just let me know since I won't be able to see both at once?
Sure.
Okay, so let me try my best to share the screen here. Okay, can we all see the slides? Mary, can you see the slide?
I see click to exit full screen. Although I see Allie just waited. Yes, saying yes. Okay.
Oh, she can see it? Okay.
Yeah, we got it.
So you should be seeing a solitary confinement cell and a title. We see that?
We did, and now not.
Maybe it's delayed. How about now?
It just says click to exit full screen. Now we see it. Now we've got it.
All right, how about now?
No, click to exit full screen.
Are you, everyone is, can someone else tell me if they're seeing that, or if that's just Mary? When I do this, are you seeing a screen?
We're getting feedback from Allie, who says it says click to exit full screen, what I'm seeing.
Why? Why would it do that? Okay. Okay, let me try again. Because I want us to be able to see the full screen if we can. Okay. How about now? What are you seeing?
Now we see it. Yes.
Okay, great. So welcome everybody. As I said, my name is Nicole Capizzello, and I'm excited to be presenting here at the inaugural Social Work and Law Symposium. And Mary, you just want to introduce yourself quick?
Yes, my name is Mary Buser, and my apologies. I am an actual person. I don't know what the glitch is, but anyway, I am right here. And I am an LCSW, and I'm a founding member of Social Workers and Allies Against Solitary Confinement. And what prompted me to help establish SWASC, as we call it, is that I'm also a former Assistant Chief of Mental Health in the Rikers Island Solitary Confinement Unit. This experience also led me to write a book that you will see in the next slide or so.
Great. So today we'll be presenting policy practice and legislative action, promoting healthcare ethics to prevent correctional abuse, and this will specifically focus on solitary confinement. So we're going to start off with introductions. Mary already went into that a little bit, and I'll do mine in a second as well. And then we're going to talk about what solitary confinement is, why this is the issue that we are dedicated to, how our organization formed, and what we do. And we're going to specifically focus on solitary confinement legislation that we've been working to get passed here in New York State. Yeah, so there's Mary. And as she mentioned, she's the author of a book called Lockdown on Rikers, and also the former Assistant Chief of Mental Health. So there's what she looks like if you could see her. And there I am. And I received my MSW in 2020, and I'm currently a doctoral candidate at the University at Buffalo School of Social Work. And like Mary, I'm a member of the organization Social Workers and Allies Against Solitary Confinement. And both of us have also worked with a campaign called the New York Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. And unlike Mary, I have not worked as a clinical social worker in a correction setting, but rather most of my efforts and experience have been dedicated to bringing about change at the macro level. This has also in part been some of my research focus as a PhD student. So in 2019, I heard about the organization Social Workers and Allies Against Solitary Confinement, also known as SWASC. And this may seem like a niche cause to some people, so I first wanted to provide just a little bit of context. So first of all, what is solitary confinement? It's the practice of isolating people in closed cells for 22 to 24 hours a day without meaningful human contact for days, months, years, or decades. And here's a glimpse of what this experience is like from Herman Wallace, who survived 41 years in solitary as a political prisoner. He said, "In society, they take animals and they build what you call reserves, because they have learned that animals being in a closed area is inhumane. But they treat human beings here in a worse way. They put people here in a 6x9 cell. They are not going to put animals in a cage unless they are trying to do some experiment and kill them. That is what they are doing to these men. They are killing them slowly and surely." William Blake, who's been incarcerated here in New York State for a long time, has written extensively about his experiences in long-term solitary. And he says, "I've experienced times so difficult and felt boredom and loneliness to such a degree that it seemed to be a physical thing inside, so thick it felt like it was choking me, trying to squeeze the sanity from my mind, the spirit from my soul, and the life from my body." And that comes from a really wonderful book called Hell is a Very Small Place. That's a collection of writings about people in solitary and then by people who are in solitary. So in short, solitary is torture. In 2012, the United Nations declared that solitary confinement over 15 days is torture. And according to the Mandela rules, any solitary should be used only exceptionally and should be prohibited entirely for people with mental or physical health disabilities that will be exacerbated by it. And yet, around 80,000 people are in solitary confinement in the United States right now, some indefinitely.
So, how do social workers fit into this practice of solitary confinement? Well, first of all, let's keep in mind that across the country, social workers are working in correctional institutions, from juvenile detention centers to county jails to state prisons to federal supermaxes. They may provide programming, mental health counseling, mental health evaluations, and discharge planning. And here we see an aerial view of New York City's Rikers Island, which is where I worked. From my own personal experience, I can say that working in a correctional facility is emotionally challenging. However, working in a solitary confinement unit adds another layer to this in that it also presents unique ethical challenges. So here we see the desolation inside a solitary confinement cell, where, as Nicole mentioned, someone can be held for days, years, and decades, if you can imagine this. Food is passed through a flap in the door, and there is minimal human contact. And yet, as grim as this picture is, what it does not show you is the self-mutilation, the makeshift nooses, the blood-stained walls, and agonized shell-shocked faces that I encountered on a regular basis as we tried to provide mental health support to these isolated people. As you can imagine, working in one of these units would be ethically challenging. We'd have to ask ourselves, as I did, what are we doing in here? And if we look at our codes of ethics, it really highlights what this dilemma is all about. And it's obvious that we would have an ethical conflict trying to work in here. Social workers' primary responsibility is to promote the well-being of clients. Social workers respect the inherent dignity and worth of the person. A little hard to reconcile that with someone being held in this torturous circumstance of solitary. Over here, we have social workers should not allow an employing organization's policies, procedures, regulations, or administrative orders to interfere with their ethical practice of social work. Social workers should take reasonable steps to ensure that their employing organization's practices are consistent with the NASW's Code of Ethics. which is far easier said than done when the pedal hits the metal, so to speak. So, what to do? Unfortunately, the National Association of Social Workers, NASW, does not provide social workers with much in the way of guidance, simply stating that social workers should always practice within our code of ethics, which, again, in this situation is much easier said than done when you are working in a host setting and your values and those of your host are at direct odds. So a social worker in this situation would be faced essentially with two options: to effect change from within, which is very difficult, if not impossible to do, or leave and try to effect change from the outside, which was the option I ultimately chose. In 2014, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post titled "Solitary Confinement's Mockery of Human Rights." The publication of this article led to the formation of social workers and allies against solitary confinement. And here in this slide, you can read our mission. And I would say that over these past few years since we began, our little organization has done a lot that I'm very proud of. We've supported other social workers who've been forever changed by their experience working with clients who are in solitary. We've learned from the experiences of currently and formerly incarcerated individuals, some of whom play active roles in our organization. We've taken part in countless educational opportunities, from national panels to classroom presentations. We've created resources to educate others, particularly fellow social workers and social work students, about solitary. We've been advocates for organizations working on criminal justice reform, including state and national campaigns dedicated to solitary reforms. And in 2021, we began partnering on a piece of legislation particular to our field that is very near and dear to our hearts. And now I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to talk about why we decided to pursue this legislation.
Thanks, Mary. So although solitary is nowhere near a thing of the past, as we wish it were, according to the Unlock the Box campaign, we are in a time of change. States and localities across the country are restricting the use of solitary across partisan lines. And in 2021, 70 pieces of legislation were filed across 32 states to end some aspect of solitary confinement in state prisons and jails. And here in New York State, where both Mary and I are, after a 7-year effort, we are incredibly proud to have been involved in the passage of the Humane Alternatives to Isolated Confinement, or HALT bill, in 2021. And to date, this is the strongest solitary confinement legislation in the United States. It prohibits any solitary after 15 days and also majorly limits solitary for shorter lengths than that. And it goes a long way towards ending the mistreatment and abuse of incarcerated people in general. However, we didn't think that it went far enough, which is why we became involved in the anti-torture bill. So this piece of legislation was officially introduced a decade ago and was originally inspired by the participation of New York State licensed healthcare professionals in the mistreatment and torture of incarcerated people at CIA black sites like Guantanamo Bay. In the spring of 2021, we connected with one of the original proponents of this bill, a man named Dr. Alan Keller, who's an associate professor of medicine at NYU and the founder of the Bellevue Program for Survivors of Torture. And ever since then, our organization has been dedicated to getting this bill passed, which we see as social workers as doing our small part in upholding our professional ethics and doing no harm. So thus far, we've been a small but mighty coalition that has included lawyers, people who have been directly impacted by the criminal justice system, and students. However, the main driver of this work thus far has been healthcare professionals such as ourselves. So of course, social workers, as well as nurses, doctors, psychologists, and others.
So let's take a look at just what this bill will do. It provides a lawful means by which healthcare professionals can refuse any directives to participate in mistreatment and torture. And this is very important to have a law behind you when you are that individual trying to practice ethically in this setting. It also mandates that healthcare professionals report abuse. And I can say, for my own part, it was shocking to me the level of abuse against incarcerated individuals that takes place on a regular basis. We would have to report this now. It protects against retaliation against staff in and outside correctional facilities, which is very important because whenever we did try to speak up in the face of abuse, we could be faced with slashed tires, with threats, with an undercurrent of danger. And it is our hope that a law would protect us from this type of retaliation. And in New York State, this law would strengthen the newly passed HALT Act because, again, the UN says that after 15 days, solitary confinement is torture, and presumably this cannot be carried out past 15 days in New York State. But if there are any attempts to do so, and we know there are, healthcare professionals would not participate, thus strengthening, again, the HALT Act. And why the bill is so important is, again, the mistreatment inflicted on the 91,000 people incarcerated in New York are all too common. What we see in the news is just the tip of the iceberg. I personally was shocked at the level of brutality and mistreatment that just goes unchecked inside these facilities. And if we look to the outside, just to monetary considerations, societal costs, in terms of individual suffering, the dollar amounts for ensuing legal actions are enormous, as we know from lawsuits. Unfettered violence also has a toxic effect on the work environment and the morale of staff in these correctional settings. It is very depressing. And it protects the well-being and inherent dignity of some of society's most vulnerable citizens, i.e., the incarcerated, and among this group, people who suffer from severe mental illness, the most vulnerable people that are in there. And it removes essential ethical tension for healthcare workers. No longer would they have to agonize about reporting something. They would be mandated to do so. So that tension is gone. And lastly, it maintains the inherent dignity of the helping professionals. And again, the ethical dignity often falls by the wayside, and this would strengthen it. So, by maintaining this dignity, it makes experiences like, hopefully, what we're looking at here, actual people in these situations, a thing of the past. Let's just take Frank, who was held in a solitary confinement cell for over 22 years. And he had this to say about the doctors and nurses who came to his cell door each day with his psych medication. They always looked at me like they felt so bad, kind of doe-eyed, but they never did anything. They went right along with it for 22 years. Or let's look at Victor. Victor was in Attica State Prison, and what he had to say about the healthcare staff in the prison was, I never went to them for anything. They were not to be trusted. I could hear everything they said to people in the other cells. There was no confidentiality. They weren't like doctors on the outside. They were one of them. And then if we look from the perspective of healthcare staff, there's Mary, who was a clinical social worker, who worked in a local jail. And her breaking point came after witnessing the mistreatment of a 19-year-old held in solitary confinement. And she had this to say, I was not only a witness, but an accessory to human torture. And that's very powerful. I had no recourse, no one to report the abuse to, and no protection. And I can say that Mary was certainly bullied, mocked, got no support whatsoever when she spoke out about solitary confinement in that particular jail.
So these experiences have been what have motivated us to really work hard to get this bill passed. And as I mentioned, we're driven mostly as a group of social workers who have not had a lot of policy experience before. So we've had a pretty steep learning curve, but we had a lot of accomplishments in the last year. So we started working on this legislation, which, as we said, had already been introduced before we came, but had kind of been languishing in spring of last year. And then when the legislative session in New York State started up in January, we really put the pedal to the metal and worked on it up until it ended in early June. Unfortunately, we did not get the bill passed this year, but we did do a lot of things that we're really proud of. So we met with 15 legislators. We created a logo and 1- and 2-page informational flyers, some of which you're seeing right here. We held 2 well-attended info sessions, which were open to the public, telling people about the importance of this legislation. We went to Albany for 2 days and connected with many legislators' offices. These are some of the pictures you see here. I'm on the upper right with Dr. Alan Keller. We've been working on this bill, and then there we are on the bottom with Dick Gottfried, who was our sponsor up until he just retired this year. But he's been working with this and passionate about this for a long time. And we also ended the legislative session with 44 co-sponsors in the Assembly and 8 co-sponsors in the Senate. So we're very proud of what we were able to do. And as I mentioned, we've learned a lot through this process and are looking forward to applying all that we learned to get this bill passed in 2023. So what can you do? You can visit antitorturebill.org, where you can learn more, download and share materials, share your story or the story of someone you know if you would like to do that, whether you're a healthcare professional or someone who's been directly impacted by the criminal justice system. And ultimately, it's our hope that this bill will educate people on solitary confinement and ultimately inspire other healthcare workers to do their part to end this torture. And I'd like to end with a quote by Brian Stevenson, lawyer and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, who says, "I came out of law school with grand ideas in my mind about how to change the world. But Mr. Walter McMillian made me realize we can't change the world with only ideas in our minds. We need conviction in our hearts. He taught me how to stay hopeful because I now know that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Hope allows us to push forward, even when the truth is distorted by the people in power. It allows us to stand when they tell us to sit down and to speak when they say be quiet." So if you'd like to connect with us, I have our email, our website here, and also where you can follow us on Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now we are open to taking any questions. Thanks so much for joining us.